This is the second event in the How to Think Together series, which is a collaboration between the philosopher and the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and the Humanities at Bard College. The idea for this series was conceived when I was a visiting fellow, or when I was spending my research leave as a fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center in spring last year, so spring 2023. And obviously it came up both in relation or as a response to Hannah Arendt's really important work on thinking and the relationship between, or relationship of thinking to politics, which means collective action. But to a great degree, and as it tends to happen, it also came up as a product of thinking together. So collaboration, conversation, and just generally spending time with people who are part of the Hannah Arendt Center, and Jana and Thomas are among the foremost of those. So it's a great pleasure to have them both here with me today. As Urja has also said, we have selected a particular text to give an example of how thinking together evolves in relation to an intermediary object of thought, such as a text. Obviously, this is the kind of thing that very frequently happens in academic, but also not only academic context, but often we hear or see only the final outcome of this. So sometimes we'll read people's interpretations of one text, or we will read polemics around certain interpretations of text, but we rarely really get to witness how thinking together evolves in conversation revolving around a particular piece of writing. So in this particular event, we wanted to give you a taste of what that looks like, and obviously to invite you as audience members to join us in this process. Before we go on, I'm just going to pass on to Thomas for a brief introduction to the text itself, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar to a great extent with Hannah Arendt's oeuvre. So just to give you a brief context for what, or of what the Lessing Prize acceptance speech is. On to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Jana, and thank you for this invitation to this experiment. The Lessing Prize is a prize that is bestowed in the name of the Enlightenment thinker Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, and on the occasion of his 200th birthday, which would have been in 1929, this prize was established and then given to scholars, poets, intellectuals every other year. And after the war, this prize was reinstated, and Hannah Arendt was the recipient of this prize in 1959. This was an interesting moment because it was a moment where Germany was very much looking for reestablishing its position in the world, and for inviting here a Jewish survivor, a German Jew who now, since 1941, had lived in exile in the United States, and before that had fled Germany from Nazi persecution in 1933. So from the perspective of of Hamburg, it was an occasion to invite Hannah Arendt to speak to the German audience and to receive a prize from Germany, so to speak, a gesture of reconciliation, of slightly coerced reconciliation, one could say, that Hannah Arendt, of course, understood very well and responded to in that speech by reflecting on the position from which she is taking this prize, and reflecting what it means to receive such a prize. And I think we will get to some of the implications that are further being addressed in the context of this particular setting, so to speak. This speech comes after Hannah Arendt having become famous as the author of The Origins of Totalitarianism. And in the year before the prize, in 1958, she has published The Human Condition, nowadays one of her books that most people have heard of or have engaged with. It is before she writes the book on the Eichmann trial, So that whole controversy she's also known for, so to speak, or her name is known for, has not yet happened. So we are in that situation and context.
Interregnum of thoughts. Sorry, Jana, were you going to add something?
No. Go
Okay.
ahead.
All I wanted to say is, and today we will be addressing in a lot of ways what it means to think from certain historical interregna, so to speak. So what does it mean to speak from a particular position, and whether thinking together develops or changes in relation to what kind of historical position we're speaking from. So basically for the remainder of this event, all three of us, or each of us, is going to take a turn first by introducing and then offering a brief reflection on a particular aspect or element of this speech or text that has been published in Men in Dark Times, and the link to which Georgia has kindly put in the chat, so you can also check it out yourselves. And then we'll move on, hopefully, to a bit of a discussion around what reading together in this sort of way, or orienting around a piece of writing, can tell us about the process of thinking together. So now we'll pass on to Jana Schmidt. You're very lucky today to have a plethora of Janas in this discussion. And so Jana will begin with a bit of reading and a bit of interpretation.
Thank you so much, Jana. Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating text. If you don't know it, find it online. There's a version of it online. And it's a fascinating text in multiple ways, because it is one of the first times, I would say, where Hannah Arendt returns to Germany and addresses something like a German public. It is a text about friendship, which is interesting in this regard, right? And as Thomas says, by extension, about reconciliation in some way, but a very complicated notion of reconciliation. And it is about thinking and freedom. In a sense, what Arendt is doing, or what she's performing here, is also making some space for herself to return to as a German Jewish thinker in post-war Germany, in an atmosphere which she had previously described as a vicious refusal to face and come to terms with what really happens, right? So she, through Lessing and through this concept of friendship, creates some space for herself. And I wanted to read one brief little passage, basically just 2 sentences to you, to start us off with. So she writes, "For Lessing, thought does not arise out of the individual and is not the manifestation of a self. Rather, the individual, whom Lessing would say was created for action, not ratiocination, elects such thought because he discovers in thinking another mode of moving in the world in freedom." And my idea was to wonder a bit about how fascinating of an idea that is, thinking as another mode of moving in the world in freedom. What could that mean, and in what sense is thinking a way of moving in the world? So, and by extension, questions like, how does Arendt think about movement as constitutive of public space? How does she animate what is usually thought to be a kind of static conception, namely thought, into a kind of movable feat, if you will? And, I think that her definition of thinking and action as both forms of the freedom of movement is really interesting, both in terms of the sort of philosophical stakes, but also in terms of the politics, because as you all know, the freedom of movement is a human right that is guaranteed in the Declaration, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And more so, it has long been the focus of refugee groups and anti-deportation groups, such as No One is Illegal, who argue that the freedom to move around, to move through, and to take up residency where one is not a citizen, is related to all other fights for rights of visibility, because it guarantees the public sphere in which we can appear. So this freedom to move is really crucial. And I guess I'm suggesting for our discussion that this type of position thinking, which isn't actually about taking a position and inhabiting it, but about a kind of network of positions, is a form of thinking together. In a different place in that same essay, Arendt speaks of a thinking that, quote, moves freely without crutches over unfamiliar terrain. And I think that, again, this language of space and of terrain and moving across it has all of these anti-nationalist and deterritorialized valences in thinking about freedom of movement. Ultimately, I think, or not ultimately, but one of the things that she presents us with here in terms of thinking about thinking is thinking as a way of relating to the world in a movable, in a moving, in a you might say effervescent or explosive way. So another quote that speaks to that is where she defines thinking as to stimulate others to independent thought, and this for no other purpose than to bring about a discourse between thinkers. And discourse here is in the German is Gespräch, not discourse, as Thomas helpfully noted when we first met to talk about this. So that's my little contribution. And I know that you both selected other passages that speak to this.
That's great. I was just going to say, before we pass on to Thomas, and especially on this note of the difference between Gespräch and discourse, I'd like to just highlight what you've said, which I think is really important, and that is also the relationship between freedom of thought and freedom of movement, and also the way that that relates to both Arendt's writing and positionality as, you know, a writer in exile, someone who was effectively a person without a state, so a patriot for a while, but also the broader tradition of exilic writing, both in the context of World War II and then post-war Europe and beyond, but also as, in a manner of speaking, a form of genre, a form of position taking that's on the one hand dispossessed, but on the other hand distant, whilst, in a manner of speaking, looking in, and thus, again, as both of you have highlighted, the occasion and the context of the Lessing speech is in and of itself a really interesting one. But I'll stop here, and I will pass on to Thomas to say a bit more about your focus within the passages, and then I'll come back to that, and then we can hopefully carry on with a bit of discussion.
Thank you. We may also use the freedom of movement if you want to continue right away. This is fine as well. I would like to elaborate, or let's say continue and highlight this relationship between thinking and the world that Jana already mentioned. That is that has become, you know, the stakes, as it were, in a post-totalitarian situation, in particular, when that situation is one in which the force of thought, the force of thinking out an entire world how it could be, namely the world of a racially homogeneous dystopia, we would say now, but you know, a consistent world that had been thought out by National Socialism, or the idea of a classless society that had been thought out quite elaborately by the regime in the Soviet Union, was, so to speak, forced onto the world in order to change the world for the better, for whatever worldview of in the perspective of whatever worldview we were talking about. And of course, at that point, the rubble and the waste of that relationship between, I don't know if we would call it thought, but of ideas and the world, was in front of everybody. And Arendt, I think, together with Lessing, points to that task of the relationship between the philosopher, one could say, or between the thinker and the world, and how can this relationship be conceived of in a non-coercive way, in a way that doesn't force ideas into the world, so that the world looks like the way it did after the Second World War. And and she does point out the role of the world for Lessing as something that has not been very welcoming, a very welcoming experience for Lessing either. And she says at the beginning, this very interesting, towards the beginning of her speech, this interesting sentence, where she says, "For Lessing never felt at home in the world as it then existed, and probably never wanted to, and still, after his own fashion, he always remained committed to it." I really love that distinction that is being made of Lessing not feeling at home in the world, and yet, as a thinker, remaining committed to it. I also want to point out the way in which Arendt uses the conjunction "and" here in order to make a distinction. He does not feel at home and stays committed. So that kind of distinction is crucial. And let me point out one more passage maybe, in which that relationship between the world and the thinker is being addressed in that speech as well. It's a little bit later in that speech where Arendt says, "But we are astonished that Lessing's partisanship for the world could go so far that he could even sacrifice it to the axiom of non-contradiction. The claim to self-consistency, which we assume is mandatory to all who write and speak. For he declared in all seriousness, quote, 'I'm not duty-bound to resolve the difficulties I create. May my ideas always be somewhat disjunct or even appear to contradict one another, if only they are ideas in which readers will find material that stirs them to think for themselves.'" End of quote. He not only wanted no one to coerce him, but he also wanted to coerce no one, either by force or by proof. And she then points out that what he leaves in his work are fermenta cognitionis, of fragments of thought, one could say, that then stir up self-thinking or independent thinking instead of bringing others in line of one's own very consequential thought to which there is no alternative, possibly, Yes, there's more to say, but maybe I can leave it here for now.
I was
and
going
pass
to
it on
say,
to Jana.
it's actually a really great point, because I think it highlights, which you referred to as non-coercive thought is another, in effect, another form of freedom or I guess, repeating or in some ways echoing Jana's point about the relationship between freedom of movement and freedom of thought, and the ability to sit with this incoherence or lack of perfect coherence, sort of ambiguity and the ambivalence of thought, and to actually leave it unfinished seems to be what Lessing is suggesting, and then Arendt, I think, takes up as the prerequisite for leaving enough space in the world, but also in the process of thinking for others. Because it seems that, and I fully agree with your reading, that thinking can also become coercive, and that sometimes it can even involve others whilst still being coercive in a manner of speaking. Obviously, a lot of institutional forms of thinking, at least in some contexts, try doing precisely this, but also tried being coercive in the way in which they related to the world. And the passage or paragraph I've selected from the same speech speaks about what happens when these kinds of projects reach a point at which thinking almost becomes impossible or has to withdraw into itself. We can register or detect traces of Heidegger in this form of thinking. This is where Arendt speaks about inner emigration. So I'll just read very briefly what I have in mind, or what the particular excerpt is about. So after a while, so she's talking, this actually follows some of the things that Thomas has said. And then she says, I seem to have digressed from my subject. The question is how much reality must be retained, even in a world become inhuman, if humanity is not to be reduced to an empty phrase or a phantom. Or to put it another way, to what extent do we remain obligated to the world, even when we have been expelled from it or have withdrawn from it? For I certainly do not wish to assert that the inner emigration, the flight from the world to concealment, from public life to anonymity, was not a justified attitude, and in many cases the only possible one. When people choose this alternative, private life too can retain a by no means insignificant reality, even though it remains impotent. Only it is essential for them, the people, to realize that the realness of this reality consists not in its deeply personal note any more than it springs from privacy as such, but inheres in the world from which they have escaped. They must remember that they are constantly on the run, and that the world's reality is actually expressed by their escape. So from my perspective, this paragraph, this passage, it has a midsection that I've omitted for purposes of expediency, but is something that really centrally highlights or points to one of the contradictions that we're faced with now. And it was interesting for me to observe in the past, now I think 6 months or close to 6 months, how much my own reactions to the world and my own engagement with thinking has started leaning towards inner emigration, in part as a response to the horrors that we are sort of witnessing daily on screens and on social media. I'm obviously talking about the war in Gaza, but not uniquely. There are other sites of conflict as well. And thinking about the context in which the world really does become so hostile as to perhaps challenge or draw into questioning the very purpose of thought, not only the purpose of thought as a public social affair, so as something that's an activity that happens in public, but also the purpose of thought itself. So in other words, the thinking, the world can become unbearable. And it's, I think, justified to ask whether and to what purpose does thinking in any form serve? And again, in particular, what purpose would thinking across, to put it somewhat simplistically, political lines or political divisions serve? Another thing that has been, at least to some of us who work in universities, rendered perhaps even more obvious, had it not been obvious, or for those to whom it had not been obvious before, is obviously is the fact that people will have different approaches or interpretations of what's going on, but that in some cases, thinking or trying to understand in and of itself can appear as almost a luxury in the context of really sort of extreme suffering and extreme human rights violations. So to me, this kind of passage or paragraph opens really the question of why not inner emigration. So what is still the remaining value of thinking together, especially in these contexts? And obviously, today's context is in many ways similar to the context of destruction that Arendt herself witnessed. But in many ways, obviously, it exceeds it, not least because we have other kinds of weapons and we have other kinds of excuses as well. On the other hand, it is a form of, or it is a historical context in which people can no longer pretend to not be aware of atrocities and suffering, among other things, because we witness them again daily on our screens, on social media, and so on and so forth. So for me, it really opens the question of what's entailed in thinking together and how thinking together can surpass, or maybe not, what we're witnessing at this point. I'm wondering if either of you want to come in at this point, perhaps to sort of reflect on everything that we've said and or pick up on some of the other themes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the other thing that sort of fascinates me about this text on that note is that she actually separates this question of the world from thinking, right? There is a movement in the text where she says thinking is a way of moving in the world freely, but that is not to say that they are the same thing, right? That like that through thinking we can sort of like create a world or maintain a world, or that is the prerogative of speaking, right? Speaking to others. And there's a kind of dramatic passage, one of those many dramatic Arendt passages, where she says, what was wrong and what no dialogue and no independent thinking ever could right was the world, right? So the world has been wrong for a long time, yeah? Since, according to her, since, at the very least, since Lessing's time. And there's no amount of independent thinking that could fix the world, and also no amount of dialogue, right? So this is not a kind of idealism, but there is something to the form of dialogue as moving in the world that maintains small spaces, so to speak, right? So it's not a kind of either or question, either we have a world or we don't have one, but I think a much more flexible idea of what a world is.
Thomas, go ahead.
Maybe if I may add just a couple of terms or tropes that I will not elaborate on now, but maybe we can talk further also with everybody here on this call, and that's an understanding of the world not being something that is in that sense the opposite or an opponent, so to speak, of the individual, but where the world, as well as a particular understanding of thinking that Lessing and Arendt, or Arendt with Lessing here offers, is an understanding that world is something that is between people. That world is not, so to speak, an object, but what world constitutes is the space between people, and that thinking that is mindful of the world is mindful in its modus, as it were, about this prerequisite. And so here is where, for me, in response to your question, Jana, about withdrawal or sort of an inner emigration and what kind of response one might see is, and if thinking can be a response, I think thinking in an understanding that that regards thinking as something that goes on between people, so to speak, and that is worldly when it is between people, and in which conversation is essential, right? Where that kind of thinking that is mindful about the world, that is for which conversation is a main or pivotal modus. That's something that is at least an alternative, maybe, to an attraction of an inner immigration or a withdrawal into the self. And in your really fantastic essay on the philosopher, on what does it mean to think together, where you offer these wonderful distinctions between, okay, what is thinking together not? It's not brainstorming. It's not a seminar. It's not, you make this sequence of really fantastic and really helpful, to me, very, very helpful distinctions, and very sharp and fine-grained distinctions. And what I regarded as a go-to is, okay, the kind of thinking that you might be interested in, or anybody who's interested in thinking together, is the notion of reciprocity. As soon that reciprocity is something we need to look at, so to speak, and reciprocity, I think, I was reminded of as a core of a particular understanding of friendship. So friendship, in order to be not functional and not mere pleasure, not just utility, but meaningful, is based on reciprocity. And I think it might not be a coincidence that that in this Lessing speech by Arendt, friendship is then maybe a word around which the particles that we have gathered so far also become a word, as it were, where friendship might be a modus, friendship not as something that is intimate, but friendship in which that freedom of movement in thought and conversation that Jana talked about first, and that you might have addressed as a counter to inner immigration, could be something worth spending more time with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it also basically comes back to some of the foci of our conversations, including of last year's Hannah Arendt Center conference on friendship and politics. And that's precisely the question of whether we can, first of all, for me and for my own work, the question of reciprocity, because that is something that I'm currently writing on, but also the question, which I think is the broader question of political philosophy that's sometimes tagged under reciprocity, and that is really what do we owe others, and what kind of mutual obligation is implied in thinking together, and also whether, and this is something that I would like to highlight, is whether thinking together actually involves a different kind of mutual obligation than those that we tend to normally group under concepts of reciprocity or sort of other kinds of liberal ideas of justice. Jana, last thoughts?
Oh, gee. I mean, there's an interesting provocation here. Maybe I'll just sharpen this point a little bit. There's an interesting provocation against inner immigration in the sense of insisting on one's minoritarian status, right? There's a passage in the essay where Hannah Arendt speaks about the marginalized and the kind of warmth that being marginalized creates, right? And it's it's interesting at this moment, I think, because through social media and various other effects, we have a tendency to all of us think of ourselves as marginalized, right? There's a kind of phenomenon of sort of like self-victimization or self-exceptionalism, right? Where none of us are heard and we're all isolated and we all claim the right to inner emigration, right? In some sense. And she says that this is not something that we should indulge because it is to deny our responsibility for the world, but also that we, in a way, like we don't get to claim that position of the pariah. She calls it the cheerful unconcern of the pariah, right? So she really insists that if there is worldlessness, it is to some extent of our own making, right?
That's a great point. Thomas, any last thoughts? Because I'm observing that we have quite a few quite interesting questions that pick up on some of the things, several of the things we have said. So I just want to make sure that we have enough time for these. Thomas, any final thoughts?
No, let's please move on to the questions.
Okay, thank you both in that sense. I will let Urja take on the questions. I'm noticing that we have a few, and I just wanted to say again, I mean, it's once again an example of, you know, how much interesting stuff comes up when people try thinking together in non-prescriptive and not too scripted either forms. So I don't know, maybe going forward we should try to schedule these for an hour and a half instead of an hour. But to avoid taking any more of those precious 60 minutes, I will now pass on to Urja to filter through the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was a really interesting conversation, and thanks to everyone who sent their questions in. I'll start with Anne's question that Anne asked quite early on in the chat. But Anne is asking, could you please specify that we're talking about verbalizing rather than thinking together? And she's kind of trying to get at the difference between we never really know what another person is thinking inside their own head. So how do we draw this distinction between thought and verbalization?
Jana, do you want to, the other Jana, do you want to go first or?
Thomas nodded, so I'll throw the ball to Thomas.
We've just an initial response. Thank you for this question. It revisits a moment of a conversation that Jana and I had in before. And your point was also a point that I was struggling with. The term of thinking together, we had exactly the same question. So how can thought be actually shared? And yes, conversation would be one, writing would be another one, and there could be many more, but that kind of manifestation of thought, that it enters an in-between space, is something that intrigues me very much, and that also led to our experiment to have this triangulation of the conversation with or through a text.
Yeah, and I mean, the question of mediation is important there, right? Or of representation. And maybe that explains why when we first got together, my first thought in terms of thinking about thinking together was formalism, which is about as far removed from you might think from thinking together as you could get, but formalism in the sense of a particular way of talking about our relationship to texts, and the kind of obligation to give form to thoughts, right? The philosopher Michel Surya has said that it is alone that we think together. Yeah, so this kind of provocation, where the way that I would read this is maybe wrong, but the way that I would read it in order to animate this thought is that we have a responsibility to animate and even personify the thought contained in texts and in each other in a way even. Yeah, I don't disagree with the distinction between thinking and verbalization. And I think in many of her writings, Hannah Arendt is quite a lot more expressive about the separation, the difference between thinking and action, right? But here in the Lessing speech, she takes one figure of thought for thinking about thought and animates it, if you will, right? So she takes Lessing's freedom of movement and does things with it.
And just to add to this, this is my mandatory coming out as Wittgensteinian that happens occasionally in seminars. I do the same thing in the essay, more or less. So it's not unique, and it's not the first time. But I would say in some ways, of course, you could say that thought does not really happen or take form outside of language. So in many ways, it's not. If it's possible in terms of diachronics, it's still probably not very useful analytically to think of thought in separation from verbalization or vocalization. But then on the other hand, picking up on what both Jana and Thomas have said, it's also always been obvious to me that contexts that can generate thinking together almost assume by definition that thinking together can occur prior to verbalization. So obviously reading a text together is one example, because we assume that other people will be thinking together with us, even though we have not yet verbalized what we may be thinking, but also having experiences together from something sort of conventional in the sense of going together to see a play or going to a concert, or perhaps even just listening to music together, to extraordinary and not always foreseeable events, for instance, witnessing death, war, and destruction. And in some ways, I think it's really interesting to think about how thinking together can become vocalized or verbalized in the wake of experiences of this sort, and whether there is something that almost kind of preemptively adjusts us to possible modes of thinking of others in relation to that prior to being aware of how they would vocalize or verbalize it. But I'm going to stop here because I know it's yet another big topic, and we have a few other super interesting questions.
Yeah, so the next question I'll go to is from Mihaela Frenza. They ask, with the spread of radicalism and mass propaganda online, they were wondering how Arendt would advise navigating the polarizing polemic field of politics that is today, so as to not repeat the rise of populist coercive thinking that she had to deal with at her time. And somewhat related, they also ask if there's any text that proposes an alternative political theory, which is based on Arendt's intriguing ideas and critiques.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question for this particular text, right? Because what she's advocating, if we can call it advocating, is not that we take a position and then stick to it, but that that we think in relation to others, right? That we sort of even in the way that Jana just said, sort of anticipate dialogue with others before we verbalize, so to speak, right? So and she outright says this in the essay. She says that Lessing's thinking is an anticipated dialogue with others. I think that's somewhat helpful in navigating online conversations where, right, the pressure often seems to be like, you need to take a stand and you need to be right about something. But maybe that's not what thinking, at least not thinking together, is about, right? Thinking together would be more along the lines of, what is being attacked here? And can I find something about that thing that is being attacked that is worth saving, for instance? That is a question that maintains something. And that's not, I don't think that's in the service of some kind of idea of balance, but in the service of a sense of responsiveness to the world.
That's such a great point. Thomas?
No, please go ahead. If you...
I had nothing to add.
Okay. What I wanted to add is that this emphasis of a certain mobility or freedom of movement as part of a certain understanding of thinking together is crossing the framework of binaries, right? That's part of it. Which reminds me, this goes back in part to Anne's question and tries to connect it with the current ones, is that verbalization of thought it's not about expressing thoughts. It's not expressing thoughts and bringing thoughts then together and have those expressed thoughts look at each other. I also understood Jana's essay in The Philosopher being intrigued by a way of thinking together that makes space for spontaneity, that makes space for something that happens that I cannot imagine myself, that I cannot anticipate, but where I would need the words, the gestures, the intervention of another in order to create that momentum, that generative momentum that can only happen in an interactive plurality, but not in a anticipated, cannot be fully anticipated.
See, this is one of the values of thinking together. Jana just formulated something that I've been trying to come to grips with for a long time, and there was no chance I would be able or would have been able to formulate it as well, which is the kind of the sense of obligation towards others that should perhaps govern communication, including online. And Thomas, you've just interpreted an essay I wrote in a way that's definitely much better than what I believe I had written or intended. So speaking of the value of thinking together, I think it's actually a really good example, if we do say so ourselves, of exactly the kind of the process of co-thinking that can happen in these kinds of contexts. I'm mindful of other questions in the chat, so I'll stop here.
I wanted to actually ask a question that Samina raised, where she says, could you please say more about a more flexible idea about what the world is? I think this was mentioned kind of earlier in the conversation, and she's asking what you mean by that, but I think it'd be quite interesting for you to just reflect more broadly on this thought.
Now Jana is nodding.
Now
yeah. You were nodding.
I mean, what is the world for Arendt, right? I think there are maybe two tendencies that she's sort of navigating between. One would be to say the world is reality, it's what is given, what we have, right? What we are confronted with or so. And the other would be to say the world is an idea, right? And I think she's, her thinking of worldness is always trying to connect some sense of action and some sense of thinking about thinking. And that is, the world is what is between people, Thomas already mentioned this earlier. So in that way, relationships between people form kind of like mini worlds, or they make up the stuff, the fabric of the world. So that's how I would think about it. Thomas, how would you answer that question?
I think I have nothing to
I mean,
add.
I've taken the words out of your mouth, so you have nothing.
We're all thinking together. No one owns the words. No one owns the thoughts. We have about 3 minutes left. So Urja, do you want to make the tough call, or whether we go for another question, or whether we wrap up here?
On the side of squeezing in a question. Okay, I'll just ask Isha's question. And I think we've already touched on the themes, but she asks, can you discuss the difference between personal reciprocity and impersonal reciprocity? So this conversation, for example, versus reading the work of Arendt in her room.
I think I'm going to have to take that one. I'm going to be the first one to take that. I can, but I have a book coming out on this. So if you give me a couple of years, I'll be able to answer it in about 200 pages. Jokes aside, I think that is a very good, it's not a joke as well. Part of this is serious, but I think it's a really important question that also connects to the previous topics of the relationship between friendship and thinking together, and also our concepts of friendship, quite frankly. And I think there's something really serious to be said about the guarantee of impersonal reciprocity, or impersonal reciprocity as the anchor and guarantee of relationships as we conceive of them in the contemporary world, both in the sense of market exchange, but also the idea of reciprocal obligations within the context of liberalism or liberal modernity. And then the idea of personal reciprocity as something that is usually, or is traditionally styled as inferior to that. In part because it obviously rests on the idea of the world as proximate. But as both Thomas and Jana have highlighted in the context of this particular excerpt, Arendt says that the world, or Lessing and then Arendt say that the world is always something that happens between people. And in that context, it makes sense for us to also think about what kind of distance, so what we would interpret as personal or impersonal in this context, whether personal requires co-presence or coterminous, so simultaneous presence, even if it's not physical. So for instance, if it's online. So all in all, just to kind of give a very, very brief and out of necessity reductive summary, I think that basically turns on the question of who are others for us. So what defines the distance from others? And once we move beyond the kind of fictions of nation, blood, kin, affiliation, etc., what are anchor points for relating to others? Because I think that also then turns back onto the question of what is personal and what is impersonal.
Yeah, I would take the question to the term friendship again, which is a term that, of course, has an intimate definition or understanding, and it has an understanding that this essay in particular points us to, that is of a political relevance. And it is political insofar as friendship can be a mode in which, picking up on what you just said, Jana, difference can have a place like in maybe hardly any other mode of social relationship, where a friendship does not require sameness in the same way that the entire vocabulary around fraternité and family kinship suggests. And that's one impulse that I take from this essay in particular, an impulse of what if we thought of political relationships in the mode of friendship rather than in the mode of, relationships of necessity that have sort of a natural foundation in their also in their metaphorical valences. Yeah.